Let's talk about what you do. Do you work or are you a student? I am working right now. What's your favorite thing about your job? Well, getting paid at the end of the month. This is what you don't want to do in the speaking test if you want a high band score. In this video, I'm going to show you 13 different ways to give longer answers in IELTS speaking. But before we get started, if you're just not sure how to prepare for IELTS, make sure you check out our full IELTS preparation course. It's taught by me, an IELTS examiner, and it takes you through every part of the test step by step and shows you how to get a band 7+ in every single part. All right, let's get into the first method, which is using WH questions. So using WH questions is one of the most simple ways to make your answer longer. So for example, if you say something, you could talk about who, what, when, where, why, or how. You could even use a combination. So you could talk about who, and maybe you could also talk about why. You don't need to just talk about one only. So let me show you an answer which uses this method right now. So let's pretend the question is a very simple one. What's your favorite hobby? Well, a lot of students might just say something short like this, playing the guitar. Well, we need to expand that. We need to make it longer. So we could say, I usually practice in the evenings after work when the house is calm and quiet because it helps me unwind. So this is clearly talking about when the person plays the guitar. Every now and then I learn a new song to challenge myself and keep my skills sharp. So we've added a little bit more information to finish off here. So that was using when to make our answer longer. Let's do that again, but let's use who to expand the answer. So again, let's look at this same question. What's your favorite hobby? Well, to expand this, we could say something like, I often play with my father, who's been a guitarist for over 20 years. He's teaching me techniques that you don't really find in books, and it's become a nice way for us to spend time together and share something we both enjoy. So we've expanded this one by talking about who the person plays with their father, and then they give a little bit more information about the father and what they do together. So that was how to use WH questions. Let's move on to the next method, which is reasons. This next method is also pretty simple. If you say something, explain why. Give a reason for why you say something. So let's pretend the examiner asks you in part 3, why do some people prefer to work from home? Well, a lot of students might say something really short like this. They enjoy the flexibility. Okay, fair enough. That's your main point, flexibility. But why? Well, we could say it means they can set their own schedule and avoid wasting time commuting. This extra time often allows them to spend more quality time with family or focus on hobbies. So we've expanded our answer here by talking about why. We've given our main idea and then we've given a reason. And then you could even make this answer longer by continuing and saying something like, if they didn't have this extra time, And just remember with this one here, your reason doesn't have to be your own reason. You might also share the reasons that other people might have, or just reasons that you've heard or you've seen. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is examples. A lot of the time, if you talk about something, it's going to be very natural to give an example, whether that's in part 1, part 2, or even part 3 speaking. So let's pretend that the examiner asks you, how might future technology change education? Well, you could start by saying something like this. It could make learning more interactive. Well, that's good. That's a main idea, but we need to expand that. So for example, students might use virtual reality to explore historical events or travel inside the human body. So we're giving a very specific example here. And then we talk about that example. We give a bit more information about it. So that would make lessons far more interesting than just reading about it in a book. Now, just be careful because you don't always have to say, for example, to start talking about an example. There are many other better ways you can use to talk about an example. So you could say something like this. This can be seen in place where they, dot, dot, dot. This can be seen in Japan where they, dot, dot, dot. A good example of this is, dot, dot, dot. Take example, for instance. One case that comes to mind is, dot, dot, dot. A lot of people experience this when, dot, dot, dot. So you can see here that there are many different ways to talk about an example, and you don't always just have to say, for example. Let's move on to number 4 now, which is opinions. Never be shy to tell the examiner what you think about a certain topic. It's another way to expand your answer. So if the examiner asks you something like, how often do you eat out? Well, maybe you might start by saying, I eat out maybe once or twice a month, usually on the weekend. Well, you could give your opinion about eating out. So for example, personally, I think restaurant food is a bit overpriced for the portion sizes, but it's worth it occasionally for having the atmosphere and not having to cook. I'm quite selective as to where I go because... So you can see here that the topic is about eating out. It's about restaurants. Well, you can give your opinion about this topic to make your answer longer. Now, with that previous question, it wasn't really asking for your opinion, but we gave an opinion to expand our answer. Some questions do ask you directly for your opinion, like this one here. Do you think traditional books will disappear in the future? This is clearly asking about your opinion, so to make your answer longer, that's what you can talk about, your opinion. Obviously, you need to start by giving an answer. So do you think yes or do you think no? So we could start by saying, no, I don't think so. Many people, including me, still prefer the feel and smell of a real book. Ebooks are convenient, but they can't fully replace the experience of turning actual pages. And for some readers, that physical connection is ... So we've given our opinion very clearly, and then we've explained why we have our opinion. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is feelings. This one is similar to giving your opinion, but instead of focusing on what you think, you focus on how you feel. So it could be emotions like excitement, frustration, or even boredom. And these feelings can just help you to naturally expand your answers. So let's pretend the examiner says, what do you usually do after work? Well, you could start by saying, I usually go for a run, but obviously that's way too short. So we can expand it by talking about our feelings. It really clears my head and makes me feel more relaxed after a stressful day. I actually look forward to it because it's my way of alleviating stress. Alleviating stress just means to reduce stress from work before it builds up and becomes a problem. Now, with this method here, you don't always have to talk about your own feelings. You could talk about the feelings of other people. So if you get a question like, why do some people choose dangerous hobbies like rock climbing? Well, you could start by saying, well, for a lot of people, I think it's about the thrill and the adrenaline or the excitement. I haven't done anything like that myself, but I would imagine there's a real sense of accomplishment when you manage to do something that it's a bit risky and it pushes you outside your ... So you can see here, we're not talking about our own feelings. We're guessing how other people feel when they do this thing. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is comparisons. This method is about talking about how two things are similar or different. So you can compare anything, really. I mean, you could compare people, places, times, even experiences. So if the examiner asks you, where do you usually buy your clothes? Maybe you could start by saying, I normally shop online. Obviously, that's too short for the full answer. So let's expand it. It's far more convenient than going to a store because I can browse anytime without traveling. So you can see here, we're clearly comparing shopping online to going to an actual physical store. In physical shops, however, I sometimes feel quite rushed or pressured by staff, but online I can find exactly what I want when I want. Now, this is a really nice length for an answer. It's not too long, not too short, and you can see most of it is just making comparisons. We're talking about the differences between online shopping and physical or shopping in physical shops. Sometimes the question might ask you directly for the difference between two different things, and in this case, you should compare them. For example, if the examiner says, is it better to read a book or watch a film? Well, you could start by giving your opinion about which you think is better. I'd say reading the book is better. Books usually have more detail, which lets you imagine the story in your own way. So we're giving a comparison here. We're saying books normally have more detail than the film or the movie. In contrast, films have to condense everything into a couple of hours. Condense just means to make smaller, which often means leaving out key parts or changing. And note with this one, that we have said in contrast. In contrast is a great discourse marker, and that's going to help you improve your fluency band score for speaking. All right, let's move on to the next one now, or the next method, which is talking about the past or the future. Sometimes the easiest way to make your answer longer is to talk about something that happened before or what might happen later in the future. Let's start with the past and pretend that the examiner says, what do you do to relax? Well, you could start by saying, I usually listen to music. So we're clearly answering the question, but let's make it a bit longer. Back in university, okay, that's the past. I would spend hours lying on my bed with my headphones on, which helped me to switch off from the stress of assignments and exams. Even now, I still do this, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So for this question, we've talked about the past and the present. So that one was mainly about the past. Let's have a look at an example which talks about the future. For example, how has technology changed education? Well, you could start by saying, well, for one thing, it's made learning far more accessible, which is a massive benefit, especially for those who live in rural areas. So this is mainly talking about right now, but in the next sentence, we talk about the future. So over the next decade or the next 10 years, it's going to advance or move forward even further and faster. I think we'll see some more virtual classrooms and interactive learning. So to finish off, we're giving an example about what might happen in the future. All right, let's move on to the next one now, which is causes and effects. So let's quickly talk about what cause and effect actually means. When it comes to cause, that's talking about a reason why something happens. Okay, it's talking about the reason. For example, there was a lot of rain. Okay, this is the cause. This is the reason for something. When it comes to the effect, that is the result. That happens after the cause happens. So for example, there was flooding. So first there's rain and then there is flooding. Flooding is the effect. So let's pretend the examiner asks you something like, is it important for children to exercise at school? You could answer by saying something like, yes, I think it's essential. So that is a very clear answer. Let's expand that. Regular exercise not only improves their physical health, it also helps them stay focused in class. So we're really talking about the effects here. We're saying if children exercise, well, the effect or the result is they're going to have better physical health and they're going to be more focused in class. From my experience as a teacher, when kids have a chance to move around and burn off energy, they tend to be less restless and dirt. And just something to note with this last sentence here, you can always talk about your experience. As we've done here, we've said from my experience as a teacher, and then we've talked about our experience. This is also another great way to expand your answer. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is number 9. And number 9 is talking about advantages and disadvantages. Most things have positives and negatives. So to extend your answer for any topic, you could talk about one or even both. So for example, if you get the question, is living in a big city better than living in a small town? You could start by saying something like this. Yes, I think it can be argued big cities are the superior option because there's so much to do. So we're clearly giving our opinion to start off with. And we've also given an advantage. We've said in big cities, there's a lot to do. Urban areas have better job opportunities, entertainment and public transport, even more benefits. However, great discourse marker, there are some notable downsides, including So in this answer, we're talking about some of the good things and the bad things. So you can see that with this answer, we talked about some advantages and disadvantages, but please note that if this was a real answer, you would need to give more detail. You couldn't just say, cities have entertainment, cities have better public transport. You should expand that and give more information. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is add another idea. Sometimes you might be talking about a certain idea and then you just can't think of anything else to say about that idea. In this situation, you can simply move on and talk about something else. So let's pretend the examiner asks you, what do you do on the weekend? Well, to start off with, you might say something like, I usually spend Saturday mornings hiking in the hills near my house. It's a great way to stay fit and clear my mind after a busy week. So we've clearly got a main idea. We've talked about hiking. Then we give a little bit more information. We're saying it's a great way to stay fit. And then if you can't think of anything else to say about this, simply add another idea. I also often meet up with friends in the evening for dinner. So this is the second idea, meeting up with friends, and this helps me get in some much needed social interactions. So please remember this one. This is a really important one. If you don't know what to say, just talk about another idea. Now let's have a look at some different phrases you can use to actually start talking about another idea. One phrase you can use is apart from that. And then you talk about your second idea. Not only that, but something else I do is. Another thing is. Oh, and. So these are some very simple phrases you can use to start talking about another idea. And it's going to make your speaking easier to listen to. Because when the examiner hears these phrases, they're going to know, okay, the test taker is now going to move on to another idea. All right, let's move on to the next method now, which is tell a story. Now, this next one is particularly useful for part 2 speaking, where you you need to talk about an experience. So you simply tell a story and you give as much detail as you can. Let's pretend you get a question like this. Describe a recent holiday you went on. Well, you could start by saying something like this. Last summer, I went on a trip to Chiang Mai with 2 of my closest friends. This is the introduction. We're saying where we went. Alex, who I've known since primary school, and Tyler, who I met at university. Now, please note that in part 2, if you're talking about someone, it's always a good idea to describe that person a little bit. A lot of students have problems speaking for the full 2 minutes in part 2. So if you have that problem and you're talking about someone, well, describe that person. Talk about their personality. Talk about their appearance. A few weeks before, we got together over dinner and discussed where we wanted to go, and Chiang Mai quickly became dirt. So you can see here, we're telling a story. We're saying where we went. We're saying who we went with. And then we're moving on to talking about how it all happened. How did those people decide that Chiang Mai was the place to go to? So like I said, this method is normally used more in part 2, but you can use it in part 1 and part 3, but the story will have to be much shorter. Let's move on to the next method now, which is someone else's opinion. Sometimes you might want to talk about something you have seen or something you have heard or something you have read. This is perfectly fine, and it's a great way to extend your answer. Let's pretend you get a question like, should schools focus more on practical skills or academic knowledge? You could start by saying practical skills. That's clearly giving an answer because they are more useful to employers. I was watching the news last night and an education expert was saying, so look what we're doing here. We're talking about someone else's opinion. We're saying we saw an expert and this expert said employers are now looking for people who can solve real world problems, not just memorize facts and not just people. So this is a great way to expand your answer. Just talk about what someone else has said. Even if you can't remember the exact details, that's fine. You can just make something up. That's fine. That's no problem. I don't recommend you do that all the time, but remember, it is a speaking test. It's a test of your English. It's not a test of how well you can remember facts. Let's move on to the next method now, which is use a structure. One of the best ways to give a very well-organized answer is to simply use a structure and follow certain steps. So let's pretend you get a question which is asking for your opinion. Well, the first thing you can say is your own opinion. You need to say what you think about the question or the topic. Then you can give your main idea and you can describe the main reason for your opinion, for why you think that way. After that, you can give more information and support your answer even more. So maybe you could talk about an effect, or maybe you could talk about the future. Now let's pretend you get a question which is a comparison question. Well, you could start with an opener or an overview. So you just give a very short summary of what you think. Then you could talk about one side. Maybe you could talk about the benefits. Then you quickly move on to the other side. And then you could talk about the benefits of the other side. Now let's have a look at an example question for one of these methods. Let's pretend the examiner asks you, do you think technology makes life better or worse? You could start by giving your opinion. It definitely makes life better. This is clearly our opinion. Then we could continue and give a main idea. And we could say, in regards to communication, it helps people connect instantly, even if they live on opposite sides of the world. So this is the main idea. This is our main reason. And then we give more information. So video calls have become extremely common in recent times. So this is an example, and we're using this example to support our main idea and to make our answer longer. All right, now let's look at a comparison question. So let's pretend that the examiner asks you, which is better, living in the city or living in the countryside? Well, you could start with an overview. Both have their merits. Both have their good sides. Both have advantages. First side, In a city, there is better access to better jobs, public transport, and entertainment, so life can feel more exciting and convenient. That's the first side. Then we can move on to the other side. On the other hand, great discourse marker. The countryside offers dirt, dirt, dirt. So you can see we're following a very simple structure to give a very well organized answer. But please remember, for each side, you would need to give more detail for a higher level answer. So they were 13 tips to give longer and better answers. If you want to learn how to be more confident in the speaking test, check out this video right here. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I'll see you next time.